Good afternoon. On behalf of Engineers Australia, I'm delighted to welcome you all to our Thought Leaders series, Engineering the Olympics, Crowd Movement Strategies. My name is Amanda and I'll be your host for today. Firstly, in keeping with our custom, Engineers Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land throughout Australia and recognises their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to them and their cultures and to elders past, present and emerging. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the sponsors of the Engineering the Olympics series, which are Arup, Oricon, GHD, Stantec Carno and SMEC. Today we'll hear from two speakers, followed by a live audience Q&A session, and I encourage you all to send questions through to our speakers via the YouTube chat box. I'd now like to welcome our first speaker, Simon Ancliffe. Simon is the founder and executive director of a people flow and analytics company, Movement Strategies, which is part of the GHD group. Movement Strategies is the largest crowd dynamics and simulation consultancy in the world and a global leader in the analysis and application of movement and behaviour data from cellular phones and cameras. Simon has advised on many of the world's iconic stadiums, arenas, festivals and events: Wembley, Wimbledon, O2, Hong Kong Jockey Club, Tottenham Hotspur's FC's new stadium and Olympics, as well as crowded places such as the Grand Mosque in Mecca. Please welcome Simon Ancliffe.
Thank you for that introduction and good afternoon everybody. I'm going to talk, as billed, about the value of crowd planning for Olympics and other mega events such as major festivals, World Cups, Commonwealth Games. And it's obviously relevant for Australia as you've got the Commonwealth Games coming up, the Rugby World Cup following, and of course the Olympics in 2032. I'm going to make reference to the London Olympic Park, which although 10 years ago was a high point in games planning, but also it allows me to talk about lots of different sources of value through a single narrative, which is the development of the Olympic Park and its operation. I will reference other major events as well, though, where appropriate. So let me dive straight in. My introduction to London 2012 Games was for this venue, shown in the foreground. The central building there is the London Aquatic Centre, designed by Zaha Hadid in advance of the Games being awarded to London in 2005. The capacity of that venue is 2,800, but for the Games, the plan was for it to have a capacity of 17,500. And so there were two additional temporary wings added to the building, shown either side, very steep and packed with seats. So what's unusual about games is that their operation is very different from those of normal events or even sort of cup finals or finals. They're more complex, they have more constraints and more requirements on what they need to do. And so, for example, in this venue, the Aquatics is one of the blue ribboned events of the Olympics, which means there's a lot of media, a lot of Olympic family attending. But what's also unusual is that for swimming, people want the athletes want to watch their friends and teammates competing as well, which isn't always true, for example, of say shot put versus hockey. But if you're doing breaststroke, you do want to watch your friends competing in the freestyle. And so this building has to accommodate lots of Olympic family, media, non-competing athletes, but also swimming prides itself on being an accessible sport, so there's a high accessibility requirement. And that's shown in the next slide, where this is a snapshot from a simulation that I'll run of the Aquatic Centre on one of those two temporary stands. It shows a number of colours. The colours represent people from the different groups. So blue are non-competing athletes, green is media, purple is Olympic family, orange is wheelchairs and their companions, and yellow is represents general admission. And you can see those groups are separated, and that's because the Olympic rules require that their Olympic family are separated from media, separated from non-competing athletes, separated from general public. And so the movement pattern is quite complex in this venue. And here we show a simulation of people leaving under normal egress. And in this scenario, there were 1,300 non-competing athletes. And the people are making their way to lifts to be carried away, or to stairs to get out of the building within a certain time. So the concept of operation for this venue is complex for the games, and of course it's also a temporary and permanent structure, making it more complex and costly as well. So it's a common theme that you need to understand the concept of operation for venues before getting into the design. And that's true of the Olympic Park as a whole. But one of the other things I want to tell you about planning for Olympics is that obviously it takes a number of years. For us in London, we had the Games ordered in 2005 for 2012. So Brisbane has a bit more, but conversely Melbourne has much less. Melbourne and Victoria for the Commonwealth Games. So this was the master plan presented in the bid and subsequently developed. And it shows a model of an Olympic stadium, a basketball venue, lots of wide paths through an Olympic park leading down to a river with 3 bridges here. You can see a baseball centre, hockey pitches on this side of the river, and this was a fencing venue. In the background, you can see the what is now the O2, but was previously the Millennium Dome. So an asset that wasn't very successful as in its original form, but went on to become a very successful venue in legacy. So let's see what was actually built, and you can see a rather different looking Olympic stadium. What was the basketball venue is no longer there and has moved up to here. Hockey pitches have moved across to this side. You can see a velodrome in the foreground. You can also see an unfortunate bit of infrastructure in the Olympic Park, which was an electricity substation that couldn't be moved. And where previously there were 3 bridges, there are now only 2. And crowd planning had a fundamental impact on all of those aspects, except the substation, which couldn't be moved and was in the way. But you can see the size of the park, the general circulation area, known as the common domain, was affected by crowd planning. In other words, we specified the size, as we did the width of the bridges. And you can see these are sizable and expensive bridges, and there were 27 of those in the park. And we also influenced its shape. And so I'm going to come on and talk about how that happened and why that was the case. But you can see that the baseball and fencing have gone, and that's recognising the cost pressures as you start to develop the games. So I've also put in on this diagram a dot represents everything where crowd planning had an impact in this picture. And it was both design and operation. And again, a common theme that I want to talk about is the integration of operation, the concept of operation into design. So how did we go about that? First of all was setting the crowd planning principles. And there were no design guides, and there aren't for an Olympic Park. So our overriding principle, I think, was that the park needed to be comfortable but busy if it all goes to plan. But we would accept uncomfortable, but it needed to be safe if it doesn't go according to plan. And then we started to quantify those by putting the design principles into what was called a crowd movement data book. That was also important at the time because we had new guidance coming in from the Sports Ground Safety Authority in 2008, just as we were about to write the design standards, so setting out the numerical parameters for how crowd flow should be accommodated. There was a change, so we had to accommodate that. And at the same time, we also wanted to understand how many tickets were going to be sold and how many people were in the park. The data book captured all that data and other parameters like security screening rates or transport plan into one document, and that allowed, which was version controlled. So as change happened throughout the development of the games, we were always able to reference back to a common set of assumptions, which is important when you've got thousands of people in different teams from different functions or different venue design teams, all trying to bring together an integrated plan. In terms of design standards, this is the Olympic Park in Beijing, looking across from the Bird's Nest Stadium to the Water Cube, their aquatic centre. And you can see there's plenty of space there, but arguably it was not vibrant enough. In other words, there's too much space per person. there to give it real vibrancy. And it was hot and rather sterile in that park. And so we didn't particularly want that, but you also have to reflect that the number of people in a park or in a precinct, it doesn't need to be a park, can change over the course of the games. And later on in the Paralympic Games, this was an image from the evening in the Paralympics, which feels much more vibrant and joyful to be in. And so that's the standard we were really aiming for. We also had to look at how many people would be in the park, and that's not just a function of the tickets, the number of tickets sold. It's a function of when people arrive and depart and how long they stay and whether people have multiple tickets or not. And this chart was something we ran through 3 or 4 years in advance of the games. And it was an absolutely vital chart that, it's one of those few pieces of analysis that I can say saved hundreds of millions of dollars by itself. When we were thinking about the size of the park, we had to decide whether we were going to design to the peak, which would make sure it was safe, or do we take a view that actually we can don't need to design to that. That peak represents 15 minutes across 2 weeks, and we can accept a bit of discomfort for that short period of time. And by designing to a lower standard, we will save hundreds of millions of dollars, which is in fact what we did. But at the same time, we also have to recognise that this forecast was many years out. And so things could change and would change. So the number of tickets sold may go up, or that we've got the forecast wrong, or that people behaved in some different way. As it turns out, we did design to that lower peak. It also allowed us to sell more tickets because we could see that there were space in week 1, particularly when the Aquatics is on, but the Olympic Stadium is not. But there was space to sell non-event tickets, and that brought extra revenue for the organising committee. So this chart really was very valuable. The next thing we did was try and establish the movement patterns in the park. And again, that will be the case for a precinct or a city. Where are people coming from in terms of transport, and how are they walking around the park? So we considered the arrival profiles and the departure profiles via each transport hub, and then started to think about how would they circulate if they were visiting 1 or 2 venues. And this was one itinerary that they might follow, which would seem to make sense for their once-in-a-lifetime visit to an Olympics, that they would want to see all of the park and potentially 1 or 2 venues, and half of that would be for the Olympic Stadium. So we ran a number of those different scenarios, and that allowed us to look at how the park performed as a whole. And yet again, we did another simulation where, in this case, you can see blue dots and green and yellow and red. And in this case, blue represents not very crowded and red represents crowded. So as we run this simulation on a scenario, which was the early afternoon changeover, which was between the morning and evening sessions of the Olympic Stadium, which we had identified as one of the busiest periods, it allowed us to see whether the circulation widths in the precinct were wide enough or not, and where the orientation and arrangement of venues created difficulties. And, there's clearly an area here in red representing high density where we had to pay attention to what kind of merchandise and food and beverage overlay, toilets and other facilities was in this area opposite this junction. So the design changed as a result of this kind of analysis. If I can go back to this picture and talk about the next thing after the aquatic centre that I entered, although it was the security screening area, which was a very large security screening area indeed, next to the sponsors' hospitality, which looks across to the aquatic centre and the Olympic Stadium, and later the orbit, which we'll talk about in a bit. And early on in the games, let's go back. In 2005, when London was awarded the games on 6th of July, unfortunately, we had a terrorist attack, 7th of July, 7/7, and so security was a major consideration throughout the games, as it always is now. The others, by the way, were transport and cost. So those are the constant themes that people try to evaluate and make work throughout the planning for the games. So in designing this area, it was one of the early considerations was what was the land needed for a security screening area. And this shows a map of that bit of the master plan where pink is the security screening area, sponsors hospitality shown. And of course, this thing about cost means that the organising committee want to get revenue. And one of the main ways of doing that is from sponsors' hospitality. And so this prime spot, the organising committee wanted the security screening to be as minimal land take as possible. But of course, everybody knew that security had to be good. And so we had to test what was the security process, what was the security equipment needed to implement that process, how many people were going to arrive over what time periods, and from what routes. I'll come on to transport in a bit, but people arrived at this major entrance via 3 different routes. And so we did lots of scenario testing and design work before arriving at a particular design, which was then tested again using crowd simulation. Red here again represents sort of high crowd density, but in this case that represents a queue outside the security screening area. And obviously it's important for security to minimise the size of that queue and minimise the size of that queue to avoid creating a target in itself. As it turns out, with this very high capacity security screening, those queues are quite large in number, but in terms of delay to people, they're a matter of minutes. So there's very high throughput, even though there might be a queue at its worst period, shown here at 8:45 to 9:45 in the morning. Outside the security screening, there's the Westfield shopping centre, which was now the largest shopping centre in Europe, Western Europe, but was being developed at the time. The security screening area was here before it went across the bridge to the aquatic centre. But under here is a new ticket hall for the railway station, shown here. You can see a number of the lines, London Underground lines coming into the station here, with other major rail lines through London to the east of England this way. And there was a new bridge which we designed to get across those railway lines on what were known as the Stratford Steps, adjacent to a bus station, so quite a busy transport hub. And there's another shopping centre through here which leads to the rest of Stratford, which was being redeveloped. So that station was extraordinarily complex. So here's a schematic of that, and in blue you can see I've put 3 subways under the railway lines connecting the station. The yellow represent all the different platforms, 17 of them, to the various different train services, and you can see also in purple that there are 3 ticket halls: the Southern Ticket Hall, the Mezzanine Ticket Hall, and the Northern Ticket Hall. So you can see that it's a complex station, and it's now, last year was the 5th busiest station in Great Britain. And we had to make sure that worked during the Olympic Games. And it had to work for the morning commuter peak, for the arrival of people into the Olympic Park at the beginning of the day, for the changeover when people were coming out of the Olympic Park and people were coming in, and then the evening peak when people were still going in and out of the Olympic Park as well, and to support Westfield Shopping Centre, which was partially open at the time. So it had a number of different scenarios for that station to operate. So making sure that the new complex station could work under all those scenarios was quite a piece of work. And we also had to make sure it worked during the construction process in advance of the Games as well. So once again, we did the analysis, but ultimately led to doing a crowd simulation of that. And here the red represents the queue. In this case, it's not a problem as people go down the stairs from this central line platform. But the central thing that we had to test was to make sure this queue could clear before the next train arrived, so the queue didn't build up back along the platform, which would be unsafe. You may remember that I said there are some Stratford steps. Those are shown here next to the Mezzanine Ticket Hall. There's the bus station. There's a queue for people to come in, and people could head off this way also to the shopping centre. And this was part of the last mile. Last mile, sometimes called grey space, is the area between the transport hub and the venues. And over the years, during the Olympics, London Olympics, but in the years subsequently, planning of last mile has become more of a major exercise for mega events. And this location shows some of the problems. When we first started planning it, there were a number of different stakeholders involved. The stakeholders for the bus station, for the transport hubs, Stratford City and the local authority, and the organising committee who would have to manage the crowds down these steps. And everybody wanted to say and say they will do it. But after a while, as they realised the costs and responsibilities that came with managing the last mile, they actually wanted others to do it. And it's very important in the last mile where you've often got overlapping land ownership and therefore responsibilities to manage the risk or financial transfers of the cost of operation. So planning for last mile, which is uncertain, and it's often public access because at this point people may not be ticketed, can be quite complex. And I am undertaking another mega event where last mile planning is coming later in the process, and it throws up some difficulties. So I'm going to take you to a more local venue. We were lucky enough to be involved in Gold Coast 2018 Commonwealth Games. And here I'm showing you a simulation of Carrara. And people are moving from the venue to the pickup points shown here, where buses take people away, or taxis and otherwise. And as this simulation starts to run, you'll see crowds moving. The important point about Carrara was considering the operation of the venue and the operation of the transport and the last mile all in one frame. And the reason for that is again, Carrara didn't operate in the way that it normally operates because of the constraints and concept of operation of a Commonwealth Games, where you can see people aren't circulating around this element of the stadium, but instead public are coming around here through the exits from the precinct and making their way to the various transport hubs. And thinking about the orientation and the layout and the arrival rate at each of those transport locations was important consideration to make sure that people didn't have to queue for too long, that their experience was good, and that the design didn't allow for any sort of crowd congestion or worse to make it work. So once again, it's the analysis and the simulation in this case help us to consider the operation as a whole to give a good customer experience. During the London Games, we used Bluetooth to monitor the number of people coming each of the routes, in this case shown in two routes. The blue dots represent where there was a location for a monitoring system. And at that time, we used Bluetooth. And the reason for that was we wanted to understand the length of stay of people within the Olympic Park, because the length of stay affected their overall the overall number of people in the park, and that was obviously a safety consideration. So we wanted to understand that, and we wanted to understand how these two routes were performing and what was the delay at the security screening area. So we put up Bluetooth sensors to understand. These days, people tend to use Wi-Fi because more people have Wi-Fi on than Bluetooth, but there are different ways that it needs to be analysed because the pickup rate is not quite as fast. We checked the Bluetooth against ticket scans. So as you entered the park, you had your ticket scanned, and so we were able to verify that this remote monitoring worked. And we used that in the control centre, where the data coming in was compared against the forecast that we had from the previous day, or the forecast for today's activities, which had been could be compared with how the park and the transport system was actually performing. And we could also use the evidence from previous days and people's behaviours to sort of predict what might happen that day. And that was enormously helpful in a number of different ways. So we measured the population, the length of stay and their entry and exit routes. And that allowed us to forecast the next day's activities. And one of the consequences of that was that we closed the Westfield for the two busiest days of the Games. We knew that we needed that extra capacity without the attraction of that retail centre. And obviously that is a large and large impact decision with financial consequences. So it had to be well evidenced. We also measured the transport use. There were a number of different transport routes to the Games and to Stratford Station. And by measuring that, we could talk to spectators about their choices and encourage them to use different systems that would allow them to get to and from home more quickly by using those systems. But then the transport system worked in the way that we wanted it to. And it was also true that we could say in the papers in London that day or on the news, this is what happened today, and this is why it happened. It was entirely expected, and tomorrow this is what's going to happen. So if you don't want to be delayed, don't go by this station, but alternatively go by that station. And everybody else, it'll be business as normal. And so that absolutely allowed Transport for London to get on top of sort of the media and communications about what was going on. And we were also able, because we understood behaviour, to sell more Paralympics tickets. So again, generating more revenue for the Games. Coming off the Games, one of the things that I really wanted to emphasise as well is that an important part of crowd planning, when you're using existing venues for Games, they will undoubtedly require refurbishment, and normally they'll be closed while that refurbishment and upgrade is going on. But in some cases, you want to keep the venue operating if you can, and that obviously has financial consequences. And that, for example, that could occur at the Gabba, where there'll need to be some upgrading of the venue and potentially the precinct around, and potentially quite significant upgrading. And if that's the case, then it makes financial sense to keep the Gabba operating as long as possible. Here I use the example of Tottenham Hotspur. If you follow soccer, you'll know that this old Tottenham Hotspur stadium was been upgraded, of which this is an earlier stage. We were able to keep that venue continuing to operate for an extra year with obvious financial consequences, while the benefits, while the stadium was being built and now turned into the world's best soccer stadium. So at the start, I said I wanted to talk about the value of crowd planning. And first of all, the Games was voted the best Games ever by the IOC, and got a gold medal for that. And I think that was in part due to the visitor experience, but it was clearly based on ensuring that it was a safe and secure game. So back to the original question, can't we deal with safety and security 2 years out? Well, actually, we started to deal with it 6 years out, and obviously there were many people involved in ensuring that it was safe and secure, but crowd planning was part of that. We helped the organising committee and the delivery authority get licensing and planning approvals that were necessary to operate venues. And sometimes that was through the analysis, but other times it was through the using simulations to communicate to people who are non-experts in that area about how it could work. We can help with construction phasing to making sure that the venues can operate. Or, for example, Westfield, which was still under construction during the Games, allowed for sufficient walkways that people could get into and out of the Olympic Park. And we absolutely reduced the risk, and by planning beforehand and getting everybody on board, we made sure that it worked right first time. We saved hundreds of millions of pounds or dollars in costs for the Olympic Park, and also making the park easier to operate. And some of the capital cost was saved by making sure the land used, which is often tight, was just the right amount of land to be safe and comfortable, and no more, because that land could be used for alternative purposes, to sell more tickets, to put in additional facilities, toilets, food and beverage, merchandising, and so on. Or McDonald's could increase its footprint, and we were able to do all of that to increase the capacity and revenue for the Games. And the consequences an improved visitor experience, whether it was in transport or the general feelings of walking around. And that's really what won the Games, the best Games ever. But of course, that was 10 years ago. Things have moved on, and things will move on again. So Sydney was absolutely the best Games ever in 2000. London sort of superseded that in 2012. And maybe Commonwealth Games in 2026, and Brisbane and Queensland in 2032 will take it on. My final thoughts, early consideration of crowd flow maximises value, as it does with so many professional disciplines. Thinking about these things early means that the value can be maximised, but often crowd flow, in particular in respect of land use and capacity and number of people attending, is a strategic exercise. It's very important to establish a workable concept of operation as early as possible. You can't really make a successful design unless you've got a concept of operation that fits with that design and can work, and perhaps you should think of a concept of operation as a platform of a way that it can work. Doesn't mean that the venue ultimately has to work that way, but it's something you can always fall back to as change happens. It means you've always got a way that the venue can work in the way that's intended. And that has to be inside the venue, as with the Aquatic Centre, but also outside the venue, as in Carrara, where you have to think about the last mile. And last mile is a low capital cost in the scheme of these games, but it can be complex because of multiple stakeholders, publicly accessible, those two things first. There will always be change, and you have to be prepared for that, and perhaps have management systems and software that allows you to monitor that change. And what I haven't really talked about was that the legacy of the games is often in the ways of working. And in London, that was particularly around the coordination between the different arms of the transport, buses and rail and metro, that they came together in a new control centre, and in planning together, they understood each other better and had a better understanding of the impact of their actions on others, but also the use of data to understand how the system is performing. So legacies in ways of working, not just new assets. To the right, there's a simulation now in 3D. Things, the way that venues and transport assets and indeed games are planned now, we've moved from those old 2D simulations to 3D and to digital twins. And that for me is a setup for the next presentation. So at that point, I'd like to take questions, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Simon, for that brilliant presentation. I'd now like to welcome our second speaker and final speaker, Graeme Henderson. Graeme is currently the global leader Infrastructure 4.0 for GHD, a methodology to help clients deliver on their digital transformation strategies. Graeme is a senior executive with more than 30 years of local and international experience, with substantial achievements in engineering, projects and technology delivery. Graeme has deep industry experience in resources, infrastructure, energy, manufacturing and in the professional services industry, and has led the research and development group focused on project and construction digitisation for the Level Crossing Removal Connected Sites programme. Please welcome Graeme Henderson.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be here and talking with you about the great opportunities that we have before us. This is a large event, no doubt, and it does require strategic crowd planning, as Simon has covered, and that's a critical element for the success of the Brisbane Olympics and how we optimise the fan and Olympic family experience. What we also saw in Simon's presentation is the ability to continually adapt to different event profiles in different locations with the use of simulation modelling and real strategic know-how tried and tested many times by Simon and his team. We also heard about the fact that the Olympics is more than the shape of the event, and that it will change over the next 10 years. And what we think today may not necessarily be what we end up with. What I'd like to talk about now are the opportunities and some of the challenges, and I think it's extremely important for us as engineers to think about why we should do things. So what I'd like you to do is just think for a moment about some of these statements. If we imagine the potential that we could have, that we created a lovable city as a result of the Olympics that set an example globally, but also that it unlocked value across the entire country and the region through increased activities. And then imagine, as Simon's talked quite a lot about, the challenge of actually making sure that we manage the event itself. But also, another important part of that is that our communities continue to operate in an as usual fashion through the construction and through the operation of the Olympics, and then of course into the long term. So what if we had a way of actually enabling ourselves to do that, to create a virtual model of what we're talking about here and ultimately create this more sustainable future for the ecosystem and generations to come. Now, we understand that the impact from this event will be very broad, and it'll cover many of the aspects that we as engineers get involved in on a day-to-day basis. So how do we do that? Simon talked about virtual optimization to support the event. I'd like to take that a step further now and talk about how we move from optimizing the event, but optimizing the planning of the event, optimize and connect that to construction and management of the assets and management of the long term, and then the repurposing of those assets going forward. So when we're thinking about that, there are some guiding principles that we should be thinking about when designing a digital twin or a virtual twin. And now these have been adopted from the Gemini principles, part of the Centre for Digital Built Britain, and they help us to think about the opportunities that we may have before us. Now, as I said before, really important for us to focus on things like public good, things like the insights that we might get that are going to help us through the life cycle of the assets that are created and the environment within which they reside, and the value that gets generated out of all of that. And then the interaction that has with the whole program and the events themselves. But sitting underneath and the foundation for this is this basic governance and foundational framework that will ensure that we are accountable in doing this to the levels above. So one of the key issues in all of that is just making sure that the asset information occurs in the subsequent layers. Now, if you take another view of that, you can have a look and see that we start with an event in the middle of this, but that over time, that event takes on a whole other dimension. And how does that reflect into the entire ecosystem? So there are benefits to society that will come out of this. There are benefits to the economy that will come out of this, benefits to business, and then benefits to the environment. One of the most effective ways to deal with these opportunities that we have is to bring an integrated or systems approach to how we address this. So let me explain what that means and how we as engineers could think about bringing the best that we have to this historic event and the opportunity that we have before us. Now, we understand that infrastructure itself is quite a complex connection of assets and thought processes that occur to make something like an Olympic event successful. And then if you think about some of those elements, there is a planning and a strategy piece tied up in all of this. There is the assets themselves are created and need to be optimized to make sure that they actually fulfill the obligation that they have made to the business case, if you like, for the Olympics. And flowing through all of this is the information and data that occurs, and the way that actually engages and helps the stakeholders and the communities, and the way that we might in fact streamline all of that through improved automation, for example, and then ultimately how that generates a sustainable situation for both the Olympics and what's left behind, and how that interacts with supply chains, both coming in terms of things like construction or maintenance activities or service activities, all the way through to the event itself, and then into the long term, the legacy of what gets left behind. And of course, all of this, as we well know from in our world, the design and construction of all of this needs to be held in concert. So what I'd like to do now is just play a short video to describe the way that we think about this and the way we can bring a systems approach to starting to bring the best of what we have to this journey.
We've been thinking very much about our clients' business and about the challenges that they have. The demands on our clients and their business enterprise are many and varied. We created a framework that enables us to identify those areas and then think about how they are dependent on each other. So the framework that we've developed starts with the client's business at the centre. And then we frame our client's business within its ecosystem, recognising that there are a lot of elements, independent elements that impact on their business. But we really focus then on tying those elements together to elevate the entire business outcome for our clients. So just being successful in one area doesn't necessarily mean that you can be successful overall. So very much in our thinking is this idea of making sure that we can optimise the whole, not just the individual. There is no doubt that the world is getting more complex. It can often be very attractive to think about just going from problem to solution in a straight line. And I think we need to be very careful about thinking of this as a simple solution. We need to have enough pre-thinking and enough thought in the framework that enables us to make it deliverable, enables us to break it down. So you could think about the process as in its most simple form, understanding, defining problems and creating an executable roadmap for our clients. We know from experience that by following this process, we can actually go from point A to point B in the shortest and most effective time.
So if we reflect on the sentiments from that video, where are we at with the Brisbane Olympics? How might we apply this approach to the unique challenges that we'll uncover as the program gathers speed? There's multiple locations. Brisbane has made a commitment to net zero by 2032. That may be a nature positive impact. There is already identified needs to be ready at least partially for the Ashes Tour in 2029. And no doubt the need to optimise asset performance and think about the legacy left behind for those assets and how well they perform, and also create assets that are both effective today but can be adapted for future activities. So it's a connected system that we're talking about here, and it relies on the thinking that of those 10 elements, they all play a part together. So for example, we understand that if you enter into a design and construction activity, then you can't do that without a due regard for the community. We understand that if you don't get both of those elements in harmony, then you don't get a good outcome. It plays, of course, across into the planning and investment. So this codependency becomes extremely important in the way that we think about the opportunities that we have in front of us. So what does good look like in this world? If we think about this hierarchy and the hierarchy of systems that comes with it, the bottom hierarchy of this is the actual assets that we create, and those assets don't necessarily need to be just physical assets. They can be natural assets. They can be the elements of the ecosystem, but they are nonetheless assets because they all have to work together to create a better outcome for our community, for our society. Now, sitting above that is the way that these assets interplay with each other. So you think about things like intermodal systems and communities, clusters, if you like. And then we can go beyond that and start thinking about how Brisbane and the regions might interact, the way that they connect up. And then going above that, we start to think about this idea of a unified model. So again, it's not just the individual functional elements that sit within this hierarchy. It's the way that the elements sit together, nestle together in this overall systems approach. But it does start with this basic understanding of the importance of the assets and the data that's associated with those assets. It's not hard to imagine how this approach might actually start to connect up some of the other data sets that we have available to us to make sure that we actually fulfill this as part of the bigger unified model for the entire state, if you like. So where do we start on this journey? Now, I'm not going to go through each one of these 10 elements, but I would like to cover just 2 or 3 to just explore the thinking for us so that we begin to understand this approach. So if we start with communities and sustainability, we already know, for example, that the IOC have got a sustainability strategy that talks about before, during and after the Olympic Games. And we understand that they have clustered these into these areas. And what's interesting about this is that when you look at them, you start to see that they are in fact themselves linked together as well. So, for example, things like carbon under climate can't be achieved unless you actually take into account things like mobility, unless you take into account things like the natural environment. So that thinking pervades the way that we need to think about this. We can balance these things together in that twin world, if you like. So it's very important for us to think about the experience of people. And the experience of people in this world is not just at the event itself, but it's for the next 9 or 10 years, and it's for the 10 or 20 years or whatever beyond that. So we think about that as the experience that people have from all walks of life in this infrastructure that's being created and linked together. So we think about this not just as a place, but as a lovable city. So I'd like you to just think about that for a moment. This is what we're trying to create, not just a place. So our thinking then could take us down the path of a framework for lovability. Now, there are 4 elements in this framework, all of which can be measured, all of which can be then digitised, all of which can then be linked into a virtual twin to help us optimise this outcome. What's important about this framework is that often we focus on the bottom right-hand corner of this, which is about the actual infrastructure itself. But the purpose of the infrastructure actually is about helping to drive social and cultural life. It can support things like local empowerment. It can support the long-term health and well-being of our communities. So these elements become extremely important in the concept of putting humans into the process of the technology that we're talking about as well. So now I'd like to talk about the design and construction activity for this. Now, clearly, as engineers, we focus on things like digital engineering and optimizing construction and so forth. So a bit of a focus on that for a minute or two. So fundamental in a successful Olympics and beyond is the application of BIM and a common or connected data environment, which will be important for enabling stakeholders in the Olympics. Now, if we reflect on where we're at with the Olympics, how might we bring this approach to the unique challenges that we'll uncover as the program gathers speed? You know, Simon made the point very clearly that these events change through their life, and what you think is there will not necessarily be there. So you can think about construction and traffic impacts, think about that right through the life cycle, construction all the way through to final use and then beyond. How do we use it to create and optimize designs? How do we use it to optimize the construction process? How do we use it to make sure that the venues reflect the space and capacity for people? And equally, how do we make sure that the venues that are not necessarily required long term can be done in the most sustainable ways possible? So we do have these multiple locations. We do have commitments to net zero. There's already a significant need for adaptation as we go forward. And I think it's pretty obvious to us that what we see today isn't necessarily what we will see in the future. Now, at the starting point for this process, one of the most obvious things that people see are these virtual representations of physical spaces so that you can engage with people, engage with the community. And that's absolutely a vital part in this entire process. And it can be important in terms of wayfinding and so forth. But at the early stages, much of this is about getting people on board and getting the approvals, but also helping in terms of the promotion of these events. So as we elaborate these models, they become more and more valuable. The use cases can start with people movement, but they can then move across into optimising construction, reducing the costs and understanding the challenges that we're going to see through the construction process. They can start as city development processes, but that type of approach can transfer directly across to the Olympics. And this type of twin can help us to plan what we're going to build in the most effective way. And then if you take it to the next level of value or elaboration, we're talking here about moving from what may be considered a planning twin, where it's all about making future assumptions, to a live or dynamic twin where we can start to deploy real-time or near real-time sensors to shorten the cycle time of action, improve the quality of decisions, and ultimately reduce costs and uncertainty. Now, doing this will require the use of IoT technology and continuous surveying, the connecting up of equipment, the idea of the connected workforce in the field, sharing mobile data from the field, so that ultimately you can begin to orchestrate in near real time the actual activity for what will become this stadium of the future, if you like. So where does all of this fit into the future twin? So ultimately, of course, this rolls up into an overall city and regional environment. And this, of course, can build towards a fully functional and integrated system that will underpin the future development and adaptation of the entire community and the infrastructure. The ability to integrate new data sets and create future connected states is well within our reach today, and I can only imagine what it will be like in 10 years' time. It certainly won't be what we see now. And now this type of an approach is well known in some other industries, but it's relatively new in infrastructure, and I think we will see this more and more, and it will become the way that we just work to make things happen. It can also significantly support the planning process to make us more efficient. Now, I'll talk a bit about the planning process. If we focus on that and think about the overall planning process, and you think back to the Digital Built Britain guiding principles, it's the value to all of the stakeholders that needs to be considered here. It's not just the Olympic event, but rather the overall improvement in the ability of government and industry to work together in a sustainable and systematic way for our communities. And that idea starts to permeate what we call an evergreen planning process. So if we think about an evergreen planning process, it's one that actually starts as a planning process, but then goes through a cycle. And it's this move from a static planning process to a testing all the way around to real time. And then you end up with this idea of real-time asset management, if you like, or performance management, or optimizing for people, or changing the way things are laid out and operated. But it's all based around this idea of continuous or evergreen planning. Now, put pretty simply, what we're talking about here is that we have real-world problems, and if we can replicate the real world in a model, we create this risk-free space to actually enable ourselves to come up with solutions in the virtual world that then we can transfer back into the real world. It's this idea, if you like, of some people call it the digital rehearsal, but it's that idea of being able to optimize things effectively. Now, what's important about that is that it is based, again, on asset information. Now, ultimately, I'd like to put the proposal that projects exist in the context of events, projects to be optimised should actually be done as part of a system. Systems that don't actually have a focus on the people and the culture and the community and collaboration ultimately won't generate much of a lasting legacy. So the opportunity is here for us to take what's a long-term program and build on that. So what would that look like? In the thinking here, what we're talking about is putting together the projects that we see as part of an essential Olympics program, but thinking about it in the context of developing an overall system or a way of working. And Simon mentioned a bit of this in what he was talking about. It's one of the legacies that we have the chance to leave behind, doing this in concert with the communities that we're supporting. So it starts with a foundation layer. It starts with mapping workflows and understanding where the value is. It starts with testing and experimenting, but ultimately where we end up is the opportunity to establish common methods that carry on well beyond the life of the Olympics themselves and leave a legacy behind for generations as an ability to improve the way that we implement infrastructure in the country and or in the state, which at whatever level we want to think about this. So what I'd like to just remind people about is this idea that ultimately it isn't success in one individual silo that matters. It's actually the way that we tie these silos together. And we think about the dependency between them. But equally, if you think about the value that you can create through making those connections, and the more connections you can make, obviously in the most sensible and prioritised way, is the way that we can build value into this approach and think about it at projects as well as portfolio, as well as systems level. So, in summary, what I've talked about is a systems approach, taking a view, elevating ourselves away from a project approach. I've talked about the guiding principles for infrastructure creation, and those principles start to allow us to be more flexible, allow us to make better decisions faster, reduce cycle times, and ultimately reduce the cost and improve the reliability of the outcomes that we're seeking. Some of those outcomes can be a lovable city, a lovable region. It can be sustainability. It can be, obviously, a successful and memorable games that we can all be proud of. So, in closing, what I'd like to encourage us all to think about is the bigger impact that we can also have. The fact that a resilient infrastructure approach for our community helps to connect up the regions within our communities and helps us to think about how we might connect the information and data sets across our community to actually make sure that we get better critical infrastructure in place and leave behind an enhanced infrastructure assets, infrastructure system, but a better way of actually generating infrastructure for our communities. Thank you.